Hi everyone, I'm Amy Johnson-Crowe, here to help you have success in finding your family history and enjoy the process. We're talking about birth dates, specifically what to do when you find a record that gives the date of death and an exact age. Well, how can we calculate that birth date? Well, believe it or not, it actually isn't as hard as you might think. Now, I know that there are a lot of date calculators out there. There's even a formula that you can convert everything to numbers, and then there's this other number you subtract. And honestly, I always found that more confusing than the way that I was taught way back in elementary school. So let me show you an example of a time when this really comes into play. So let's say that you're out at the cemetery. We as genealogists tend to do that a lot. And sometimes we'll come across a tombstone like this for Phineas Ford. And the tombstone says that Phineas Ford died April the 7th, 1839, aged 64 years, 5 months, and 7 days. We have his date of death, and we have an exact age, but we don't have that birth date spelled out. So what can we do? How can we figure out what his birth date is? This method, as I've compared it with records that have a death date and an exact age, and it actually gives the birth date, I have found this method to be the most consistent in working it backward. That tombstone said that Phineas died April the 7th, 1839, age 64 years, 5 months, 7 days. The first step is to subtract the years. So if we're starting with April 7th, 1839, and we subtract 64 years, that takes us back to April 7th, 1775. Okay, that's all we did was just subtract exactly 64 years. Step 2 then is to subtract the months. Literally count back the months. So in this case, we had 5 months. So if we're starting in April, if we're counting back 5 months, that takes us back to November. Now you do have to be careful when you're counting back the months, that when you have a situation like this where it goes back into that previous calendar year, you have to make sure that you also note that in the year. So going from April 7th, 1775, going back 5 months, takes us back to November 7th, 1774. Step 3 then is to subtract the days. Now this is the only time you really need to know how many days are in a month. If you have a situation where you're counting back the number of days and it takes you into that previous month, you do need to know how many days are in that previous month so that you count it back correctly. So we have that situation here. Going back 7 days from November 7th takes us back to October 31st. So we've calculated Phineas Ford's birth date as being October 31st, 1774. And that's starting with his date of death, subtracting the years, subtracting the months, subtracting the days, and that takes us back to October 31st, 1774. Now, I should give a couple of little caveats to this. When you've done this calculation and you go to add it into your whatever software you're using, you want to make sure that you make the note that you calculated this birth date, that it wasn't actually spelled out on this tombstone or on this death record, because that will help you. One, you should always cite exactly what it was you saw. Well, you didn't actually see a birth date, you calculated it. But it's also going to help you later if you find another record that actually does spell out his birth date. And if there's a discrepancy, you can say, oh, well, I must have calculated it wrong, or, oh, this other record, they created it 100 years later. That one's probably wrong. You still want to evaluate. You still want to consider other evidence that you have, other sources that you have. But this is actually a pretty easy way that when we have these situations like this, where we have a death record or we have a tombstone that gives us that exact date of death and an exact age, how we can calculate it back and find that date of birth. If you enjoyed this video, click that subscribe button and hit that bell so YouTube will notify you every time that I post a new video. Also, feel free to check out my website at amyjohnsoncrow.com. Happy researching!